Now regarded as one of the most important voices in American literature, F Scott Fitzgerald died in obscurity, ignored and largely forgotten. The glitzy lifestyle of endless parties, cocktails and everyone wanting to be his friend, a distant memory. In the 1920s, he and his high-spirited wife Zelda were the living embodiments of the jazz age, handsome, successful and buzzing with energy. But like the jazz age, their lifestyle was unsustainable. I'm Graeme Yorston, welcome to my channel. Today we're exploring the brilliant but all too short life of F Scott Fitzgerald. An astonishingly creative life, but a burdened life, fatally intertwined with that of his artistic but troubled wife Zelda. In this updated and expanded documentary, I'll be finding out how the lives of two of America's brightest young things slowly unravelled, with Zelda in and out of mental hospital and Scott drowning his sorrows with alcohol. It's a sad story about two lives prematurely extinguished, but also a story about love. How their love endured through all the temptations and troubles that fate put in their paths. Or at least that's what I thought the first time around. Now? Well, see what you think. Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald was born in 1896 in St. Paul, Minnesota, into a comfortably middle-class Catholic family. His father, from an old Maryland family, ran a short-lived wicker furniture manufacturing business. His mother was the daughter of an Irish immigrant who had grown rich as a wholesale grocer. He had two older sisters who died 3 months before he was born. And as a youngster he was prone to colds and chest problems, which caused his mother to constantly worry whether she was going to lose him too. And Scott was never close to his mother, embarrassed by her inelegance and annoyed by her fussing, describing her as
half insane with pathological nervous worry.
His father's business failed when Scott was 2, and the family moved to Buffalo, New York, where his father took a job as a soap salesman for Procter & Gamble. The Fitzgerald household moved frequently and also had a spell in Syracuse. His mother read him novels and his father introduced him to the poetry of Edgar Allan Poe and Byron, and at school his teachers noticed his keen interest in literature. He wasn't particularly popular with his peers, however, as he was snooty and self-important from his mother indulging him and encouraging him to think he was better than others, and constantly pushing him to rub shoulders with wealthier families. When his classmates put him in his place, as children do, he was upset at being treated so rudely, and his early school years were unhappy and lonely. No one came to his 7th birthday party. Heavy rain was the excuse, so he consoled himself by eating his entire birthday cake himself, candles and all. When he was 11, his father lost his job. He was a kind man, but always dominated by his wife, and now at 55 he began to rely on drink. Writing many years later, when he was feeling a failure himself, his son wrote,
That morning he had gone out a comparatively young man, a man full of strength, full of confidence. He came home that evening, an old man, a completely broken man. He had lost his essential drive, his immaculateness of purpose. He was a failure the rest of his days.
The family had to move back to St. Paul to live off his mother's family money. They moved frequently, but always lived at the humbler end of Summit Avenue. Close, but not that close to the bigger, grander houses, which were a constant reminder that they were not quite up there with the best. At 13, he had his first story published in the school magazine. Not exactly vintage Fitzgerald, but not bad for a 13-year-old, and there are already clear hints of what was to come. But he remained unhappy at school. He tried too hard to make friends, and was considered a bit of a show-off. Things improved when he was sent to an expensive Catholic boarding school in New Jersey, where he managed to get onto the football team despite his relatively short stature. And in his holidays, he wrote and performed in plays for a local theatre group. It was around this time that he began experimenting with medicinal sherry, working up to stronger spirits at Newman. It was an experiment that went badly wrong, developing into a lifelong drinking habit that dulled his creativity and shortened his life. In 1913, he started at Princeton University, where he mingled with a wealthy, privileged set, writing stories and poems for the Tiger magazine and plays for the Triangle Musical Theatre Group. And, as everybody agreed he was a very pretty boy, he often appeared as a woman. Despite his Irish Catholic background, he was elected to the terribly posh Cottage Eating Club. Life was great. He had arrived. His drinking at this stage was not constant, but it still got him into trouble at times. On one occasion he ended up with a black eye after a drunken brawl at the Cottage Club. It was also at Princeton that he met and fell head over heels in love with a 16-year-old Ginevra King, daughter of an impossibly wealthy Chicago stockbroker and one of the most sought-after young ladies in America. Although she reciprocated his affections, he never really stood a chance. And when he had the presumption to pay a visit to her family's estate, her father sent him packing with the resounding, "Poor boys should not think of marrying rich girls." He would never forget the pain of this rejection, of his unworthiness, modelling Daisy Buchanan in The Great Gatsby and many others on the unattainable Ginevra. Heartbroken, he abandoned Princeton and enlisted in the army, hoping to die in the mud of the Western Front. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant and started training at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas while awaiting deployment to Europe. But, hoping to secure his posterity before becoming another First World War statistic, he decided to write a novel, dashing off 120,000 words in 3 months. He submitted his manuscript to the prestigious literary publisher Scribner's, and although they turned it down, they liked his style and encouraged him to revise and resubmit it. Fate then intervened. He was sent to Camp Sheridan near Montgomery, Alabama, where he met Zelda Sayre, the 17-year-old daughter of a wealthy and established family. Beautiful, spoiled and willful, she was an entitled Southern belle, used to having everyone at her beck and call. She loved to be the centre of attention and was the most popular girl in town, with a queue of young men hoping she would smile in their direction. It was far from love at first sight, however. Fitzgerald continued writing to Ginevra and exchanging photographs, hoping her father might relent, and he saw other women as well. But over the summer of 1918, as the war in Europe gradually ran out of steam, he spent more and more time with Zelda, at country club parties, going for long walks, and talking to her for hours about his ambitions to be a writer. In September, 3 days after Ginevra tied the knot with a rich banker's son, Scott wrote in his journal that he had fallen in love with Zelda. In October, he was transferred to Camp Mills, Long Island, to await a troopship to France. But on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the armistice came into effect, and the war was over. The 9th Infantry was sent back to Montgomery, so Fitzgerald was able to continue his courting of Zelda. Her parents can't have been too keen. He was poor, a Catholic, and a wannabe writer with no real prospects. But perhaps this was why Zelda liked him. She loved to shock, to challenge convention, and they began a recklessly passionate relationship. all her modernity though, Zelda declared she would not marry him until he was financially secure. And when he was decommissioned in February 1919, he headed to New York to conquer the literary world. But all that passion led to a pregnancy scare. Zelda wrote to him panicking, and he sent her some pills to take care of it. Fortunately, it was a false alarm. She didn't need them. And they continued writing tender and loving letters to each other, and Scott sent her a ring to confirm their unofficial engagement. He was making a modest income of $90 a month, writing advertising copy in the day and short stories in the evenings. He wrote to Zelda frequently, but he knew he would need to earn a lot more to walk her down the aisle. He persevered with his stories, working hard but with little success, getting rejected over 100 times and selling only one story, Babes in the Woods, for which he was paid the princely sum of $30. But it wasn't all work and no play. He had a brief but intense affair with English actress Rosalind Fuller. But when Zelda broke off the engagement, fearing he would never make it as a writer, he contemplated jumping off a window ledge and carried around a loaded revolver, mulling over dark thoughts. He loathed his advertising job, and after a monumental drinking binge, he decided he could stand it no longer, so he quit and returned to his parents in St. Paul, convinced he was a failure. But rather than give in and slide into the abyss of alcoholism like his father, he resolved to give it one last go at becoming a novelist. He stopped drinking, locked himself away, and worked day and night to revise his earlier manuscript as This Side of Paradise, a strongly autobiographical account of his Princeton years and his romances with Ginevra, Zelda, and others. The central character is a cruel, narcissistic flapper, very much based on Zelda. He also used part of a letter she sent him about their walks in Oakwood Cemetery.
I've spent a day in the graveyard. Isn't it funny how out of a row of Confederate soldiers, 2 or 3 will make you think of dead lovers and dead loves when they're exactly like the others, even to the yellowish moss.
In September 1919, Scott's retitled novel was finally accepted for publication, and they were engaged again. While waiting for the official launch, his short stories also started selling. The money began to roll in, and the wedding date was set. He was happy, but still a little ambivalent about Zelda, confiding to a friend,
I wouldn't care if she died, but I couldn't stand to have anybody else marry her.
This Side of Paradise hit the shelves in March 1920, and a few days later they were married in the rectory of St. Patrick's Cathedral. It was a small, hurried ceremony arranged by Scott and attended only by Zelda's 3 sisters, their husbands, and 3 of Scott's friends. No parents, no flowers, no music, no photographer, and no reception. Zelda never made her feelings known about Scott's perfunctory wedding arrangements, but they were surely not what a Southern belle would have expected. His new book, however, was an instant success, selling out its initial print run in less than a week and making him a household name. Magazines that had previously rejected him were now queuing up to publish his short stories and pay good money, which meant he was able to keep his new wife very much in the style to which she was accustomed. They lived in luxury at the Biltmore Hotel, spending money like water and becoming famous for their riotous behaviour and crazy antics, dancing on taxi roofs, doing handstands in the lobby, sliding down the banisters. So crazy that after a few weeks of their hijinks, the hotel asked them to leave. So they moved to the equally grand Commodore Hotel, where the party continued. They were the ultimate celebrity couple, living for the moment without a care in the world. Everyone wanted to meet them, everyone wanted to join in the fun. But even at the pinnacle of his success, Fitzgerald recalled riding in a taxi one afternoon, passing between tall buildings and looking up at the sky.
I began to bawl because I had everything I wanted, and knew I would never be so happy again.
His misgivings and awareness of the shallowness of their lives is very much reflected in his characters and stories of the Jazz Age, an era that was pushing back the boundaries of what was permissible, but not really offering anything substantial in its place. Although Prohibition began in 1920, alcohol was never hard to find, and the Fitzgeralds drank far more than was good for them, leading to blazing gin-fueled rows and accusations of infidelity on both sides. At first, Scott encouraged Zelda's wildness. It was fun and gave him endless material for his stories. But he started to grow weary at the strain of providing her with a constant stream of expensive gifts and opportunities to act disgracefully. Writing to a friend, however, he said,
I fell in love with her courage, her sincerity, and her flaming self-respect. And it's these things I'd believe in, even if the whole world indulged in wild suspicions that she wasn't all she should be. I love her, and that's the beginning and end of everything.
Sounds good, but their relationship was complicated and unconventional, and within a few weeks of saying his wedding vows, Scott was already having an affair. And with Zelda's best friend's sister, so she was always going to find out. Perhaps hoping to escape the temptations of the city, they moved out of New York and rented a house 50 miles away in Westport, Connecticut, so Scott could work on his second novel and Zelda could swim. She had always been an outdoor sporty girl, so having a house with its own beach enabled her to burn off some of her energy. She even tried to be a polite and well-behaved housewife for a while and invited her neighbours for tea, but this didn't last long. As she had always had servants, she had no idea how to cook or clean and happily conceded that she was completely useless as a housekeeper. When asked to contribute a piece for a collection of favourite recipes of famous women, Zelda gave her version of breakfast.
See if there is any bacon. And if there is, ask the cook which pan to fry it in. Then ask if there are any eggs, and if so, try and persuade the cook to poach 2 of them. It is better not to attempt toast, as it burns very easily. Also, in the case of bacon, do not turn the fire too high, or you'll have to get out of the house for a week.
Zelda was soon
unendurably bored
of just sitting around while Scott wrote. And, homesick for southern cooking, she suggested a little 1,200-mile jaunt to see her parents in Montgomery as a belated honeymoon. In their Marmon roadster, which they christened the Rolling Junk, they motored for 8 days solid on a trip that was filled with incident: a broken axle, flat tyres, speeding fines, crashing through a toll bridge, running out of money, and being ejected from a hotel in Virginia because of their oh-so-natty matching travelling suits. But as they approached Montgomery, Zelda suddenly started crying.
Because things were the same, and yet were not the same.
And her sadness wasn't lifted by finding that her parents were out of town, as they hadn't cabled them to say they were coming. Back in Westport, Zelda's parents came to visit them, but her father was not impressed at their constant partying, drinking and scandalous lifestyle. And responding to his disapproval, Zelda tried to prize a gin bottle from Scott's hands at breakfast one morning, but he fended her off into the swing door, giving her a nosebleed and black eye. Not wanting to spend a winter in the country, they relocated to an apartment in Manhattan, ordering meals from the Plaza Hotel around the corner and snacking on olive sandwiches washed down with whiskey. When Lawton Campbell, an old school friend of Zelda's, visited, he described their apartment as bedlam. Dishes all over the place, the bed unmade, books and papers scattered everywhere, ashtrays overflowing with cigarette butts and liquor glasses from the night before. He described how Scott would be dressing while Zelda, luxuriating in the bathtub, would carry on a steady flow of conversation with the door half open. Scott found it difficult to write if Zelda was in their apartment, as she wanted his attention, and was unable to write if she was not there, as he worried what she might be getting up to and with whom. His frustration boiled over at times and led to him getting a black eye at a Harlem jazz club one night. They both confided to friends that their marriage couldn't last much longer if they continued living at this pace. But in early 1921, Zelda found out she was expecting. And after a quick visit to her parents, the Fitzgeralds sailed for Europe. First, they visited London, where Zelda dined with Winston Churchill, did a Jack the Ripper tour of Whitechapel, and fell asleep at a cricket match. Then it was off to France, which Scott felt was
a bore and a disappointment,
and Italy, which he described as
merely of antiquarian interest.
Then back to the US and her parents' house, where Zelda wanted to have the baby. But a late summer heatwave made Scott insist on them going north. Zelda wasn't happy, but agreed, and their daughter Scotty was born in his hometown of St. Paul, Minnesota. Zelda had a long, difficult labour, and her first words about her baby as she emerged from the anaesthetic were,
"I hope it's beautiful in a fool, a beautiful little fool."
Words carefully noted down by Scott for future use. Parenthood didn't slow them down. They hired nurses and nannies and continued the same punishing round of parties as before. Soon, Zelda found herself pregnant again. She was struggling to lose weight and did not want another child, so this time she did take some pills, with Scott's agreement, a decision that came back to haunt them both later. His second novel, The Beautiful and Damned, was published a few months later. It sold well and confirmed Fitzgerald's position amongst the finest and most bankable writers of his generation. The novel, about a young artist and his flapper wife, who become dissipated and morally bankrupt through endless partying in New York, is very much based on his and Zelda's own shallow existence at this time, and incorporated some of Zelda's diary entries and letters. A newspaper invited Zelda to write a satirical review, which then led to publishers commissioning other pieces and stories from her. And in June 1922, Metropolitan magazine published an essay entitled Eulogy on the Flapper. How much of Zelda's work was her own, and how much of Scott's was his, continues to be a topic of fierce debate among literary scholars. With Scotty just a year old, they moved to Great Neck on Long Island, the model for West Egg in The Great Gatsby. Supported by a nurse, a live-in servant couple, and a laundress, they partied like there was no tomorrow in the mansions of the super-rich that surrounded them. But although Scott was earning a lot of money, they were spending it faster than it was coming in. A tragedy which he wryly documented in How to Live on $36,000 a year. His next venture, however, a play based on one of his short stories, was a complete disaster. At the preview in Atlantic City, half the audience walked out, and Fitzgerald fled to the nearest bar without even waiting for it to finish. It folded after its first and only performance, and Fitzgerald, slumped in depression, was forced into writing short stories for magazines to pay off the debt, a task he regarded as worthless in literary terms. But the music played on, and he and Zelda continued the round of endless Long Island socialising, getting drunk and arguing. Fitzgerald's feelings about the people they were mixing with and their lifestyles were deeply ambivalent. He enjoyed the parties and liked mingling with the upper echelons, but he found their privileged lifestyle morally disquieting, aware that his welcome amongst them would last only as long as his fame, and it was always tinged with more than a hint of resentment. With the hope of escaping this self-destructive excess, the Fitzgeralds decided to move to Europe to allow Scott to work on his next novel, The Great Gatsby. For source material, he drew on his Long Island experiences, especially his neighbour Max Gerlach, a millionaire bootlegger who flaunted his wealth and threw lavish parties, and his obsession with first love Ginevra King.
The whole idea of Gatsby is the unfairness of a poor young man not being able to marry a girl with money. This theme comes up again and again because I lived it.
After a brief stay in Paris, the couple relocated to Antibes and the French Riviera. Scott worked on his novel, but Zelda got bored and became infatuated with the French aviator Edouard Jossin, spending afternoons at the beach and evenings at the casino with him. After a few weeks of this, Zelda asked for a divorce, but Scott locked her in their villa and stormed off to challenge Josin to a duel for breaking up his family. But Josin had already left for pastures new, and he later dismissed the entire affair as a fabrication and claimed no impropriety had occurred. It was real enough, however, for Zelda to take too many sleeping pills and to be marched up and down all night long to get them out of her system. And it was real enough to mark a change in their marriage. Scott wrote in his notebook,
I knew something had happened that could never be repaired.
As despite all of her previous flirting and his affairs, for the first time Scott felt he could no longer be certain of Zelda's love for him. Zelda too was different. Friends noticed that she took unnecessary risks, diving off 35-foot high rocks into the sea and driving recklessly after drinking. When the dust had settled a little, they headed to Rome, where Scott put the finishing touches to the Gatsby manuscript, and Zelda did the sights. She was still suffering from a lot of abdominal pain from an operation the year before, and Scott was drinking heavily. So much so that he ended up in the cells after a brawl with some taxi drivers and taking a pop at a policeman, and Zelda had to call on the embassy to get him out. They retreated to the island of Capri, where Zelda began to paint seriously, taking lessons and discussing all the latest trends in modern art, and Scott drank as he nervously awaited the publication of The Great Gatsby, turning down a $10,000 offer to serialize it, as he wanted it on the shelves as soon as possible. Despite having 4-day-long rows with Zelda, Scott wrote,
We're still enormously in love, and about the only truly happy couple I know. The cheerfulest things in my life are first Zelda, and second, the hope that my book has something extraordinary about it.
When it appeared, the novel received generally favourable reviews, but it didn't sell nearly as well as his previous books. After wintering Italy, the Fitzgeralds returned to France, where, over the next year, they alternated between Paris and the Riviera. During this period, he became friends with James Joyce, Ernest Hemingway, Gertrude Stein, and Ezra Pound, and they spent time with other members of the American expatriate artistic community. Hemingway got on well with Fitzgerald, but wasn't so keen on Zelda, describing her as insane. He felt Zelda took Scott away from writing novels to churn out short stories to fund their flamboyant lifestyle. He also said that Zelda was constantly taunting Scott about his courage, his stature, and the size of his manhood. Jealousy on both sides, bitter, destructive quarrels, endless gynecological problems, and frustration at not being able to conceive wore them both down. But Zelda, being Zelda, still liked to be the centre of attention, and there are tales of her dancing on tables at casinos and finishing off dinner parties with a striptease and flicking her lacy underwear at guests as a souvenir. And her theatricality wasn't just confined to the privacy of their villa. While having dinner at a restaurant one night, the famous, if now somewhat ageing dancer Isadora Duncan summoned Scott over. Drunk and demonstrative, he fell to his knees in praise, and Isadora ran her bejewelled hands through his hair, calling him,
"Oh, my centurion!"
Zelda was incandescent, and to the horror of the entire restaurant, she allowed herself to fall down the long staircase on the edge of the terrace, cutting and bruising herself, but not saying a word. Something had to change, and when a United Artists producer invited Fitzgerald to Hollywood to write a flapper comedy, they abandoned Europe after 2 unpleasant years to try their luck in Tinseltown instead. But it wasn't really any different. In Hollywood, the parties continued, just with a new crowd of people, and their heavy drinking and childish pranks didn't win them many friends. Zelda complained of being bored, while Scott found companionship elsewhere. At one soiree, he met 17-year-old Lois Moran, a pretty young starlet who spent hours listening to him pontificating about literature and philosophy, and they began an affair. He wrote her into a short story, and reworked one of the central characters in his next novel to reflect their relationship. Zelda had always been the inspiration for his characters, so when some young flibberty-gibbet threatened to take her place, she was not amused. In a blazing row, Scott said he respected Lois because at least she was doing something with herself which required effort as well as talent. Zelda's reaction was to set fire to her clothes in the bathtub. After 2 miserable months, their Hollywood interlude was over, and they headed back east. For the next 2 years, they rented a huge 30-room mansion near Wilmington, Delaware, to allow Scott to work on Tender is the Night. To fill her time, and possibly as a reaction to his taunts about doing something which required effort, Zelda revived her childhood passion for dance and began seriously practicing ballet, creating her own dance studio in the half-empty house which she shared with Scotty. She also wrote several short stories, including Millionaire's Girl, her response to the Lois Moran affair. College Humor bought 2 of her pieces and considered Zelda a talent in her own right. But 5 out of the 6 stories she wrote in this period were published with both her and Scott's names in the byline, even though Scott's input was minimal. Even worse was the fact that Scott's agent submitted Millionaire's Girl to the Saturday Evening Post in Scott's name, thinking it was his work. And when it was accepted and discovered that it was entirely written by Zelda, the magazine offered $4,000, but only if Zelda's name was omitted. It is this commandeering of her stories that has led Zelda fans to vilify Scott, accusing him of stealing her work because of his own insecurities and need to keep her in her place. The usual justification given in his defence is that it was economic necessity. With joint credits, her stories commanded a higher fee of around $500 per article. Where the truth lies, we'll never really know. But the manuscripts of all 6 stories show that Zelda has crossed out Scott's name in the byline. In spring 1929, they returned to Europe, where Zelda's behaviour grew increasingly erratic. In her drive to become a prima ballerina, she practiced day and night. Her friends noticed she was becoming emotionally frayed, bursting into laughter or tears for no reason. Her thought processes changed, and it was difficult to follow her train of thought. At the movies, she would misinterpret what was happening on screen, and she started seeing things. Actress Tallulah Bankhead described how she
went off her head, poor darling, going into a flower shop and thinking all the flowers had faces.
She was starving herself to stay thin and practicing furiously to the point of exhaustion, attending classes with Lyubov Yegorova, star of the Mariinsky Theatre in St. Petersburg and Diaghilev's Ballet Russe. She was so fanatical about not being late that one day she changed into her ballet clothes in the back of a taxi, and when it got stuck in traffic, she jumped out and ran to the class. After another session, she threw herself at Yegorova's feet and declared her undying devotion. In September, she had an offer from the San Carlo Opera House in Naples, one of the oldest and most prestigious theatres in Italy, for significant solo roles throughout the season. It was what she had been working so hard for. It was a vindication of all the effort she had made. She would be independent, a person in her own right. She was incredibly excited and talked about it with everyone. And then she turned it down. It is hard to understand this decision. Was it pressure from Scott? The thought of not seeing Scotty? The fear of failure? Or was she so intertwined and enmeshed with her husband that the prospect of being apart was just too much? Perhaps regretting her decision, a month later, while returning to Paris with their 9-year-old daughter, driving along the mountainous roads of the Grande Corniche, Zelda grabbed the steering wheel and tried to drive over a cliff, shouting,
"God's will!"
Scott screeched to a halt, inches from the drop. But Zelda couldn't explain why she did it. She started hearing voices and was convinced people were talking about her, and she stopped eating. Scott thought she might benefit from a holiday in Algeria, but she hated every minute of it. And back in Paris, she was still obsessed with ballet, starving herself, practicing furiously, and taking an interest in the Montmartre lesbian community, much to Scott's disquiet. Everything came to a head in April 1930, when Zelda collapsed, exhausted, and was admitted to the Malmaison sanatorium a few miles outside Paris. She was in a highly agitated state, pacing the room, flirting with the doctors, and declaring her love for Yegorova. Leading French psychiatrist Professor Henri Claude diagnosed anxiety and advised complete rest. But she discharged herself after 9 days. Back in their apartment, Zelda tried resuming her punishing dance routine, but she was not well. Her eczema flared up. She was experiencing vivid and distressing hallucinations. It was all too much, and she took an overdose of barbiturates. After this, Scott drove her to the Valmont Sanatorium near Montreux in Switzerland. Her sexually disinhibited behaviour continued, and the nurses reported having to fend off her over-affectionate behaviour. The Valmont clinic was primarily for physical health problems, and they couldn't manage her behaviour, so she was transferred to a mental hospital on the shores of Lake Geneva. But this was no dark, gothic madhouse. Prangin was a beautiful place with well-maintained gardens, tennis courts and spacious villas where the patients were housed. Only a small number of private patients was admitted, and the doctors and their families lived on site, enabling them to take part in the life of the community. Only recently opened, it had quickly gained the reputation of being the best psychiatric hospital in Europe, and was eye-wateringly expensive at $1,000 a month. Her doctor, Oskar Forel, diagnosed her with schizophrenia, but also asked Eugen Bleuler, head of the psychiatry department at the University of Zurich, to assess her. Bleuler invented the term schizophrenia in 1911, so there could not have been anyone better qualified to make a diagnosis, and he agreed that Zelda had schizophrenia. I won't say too much about Zelda's illness, as I explore this in detail in my video focusing on her fascinating life story. Scott was not allowed to visit at first, but he remained in Switzerland for more than a year, while Scotty was mostly in Paris with the governess, apart from making occasional visits to the mountains. In Zelda's first heart-rending letter from the hospital, she begs Scott to come and see her, saying she felt
thoroughly humiliated and broken.
And, never one to waste good material, Scott reproduced parts of this letter almost word for word in Tender is the Night. They exchanged almost 100 letters over the next year, angry, blaming, apologising, trying to make sense of what was happening. At times they were filled with bitter recriminations, at other times with tender appeals for forgiveness. And Scott did his best to understand his wife's illness by reading books on psychiatry and psychoanalysis. Their letters were poignant and devoted, Zelda suggesting he should free himself by divorcing her, but Scott declared,
I love you with all my heart because you are my own girl, and that is all I know.
But despite his declarations, he met Bijou O'Connor, a wealthy, aristocratic English widow, and they had a
roaring and screaming affair,
on which he based his short story, A Hotel Child. He even took her to visit Zelda at Prangin, where she presented her with a Persian kitten, which Zelda killed by smashing its head against a wall. But slowly, gradually, almost imperceptibly, Zelda began to improve, her initial letters of anger and resentment gradually giving way to more conciliatory and affectionate letters. When she was discharged after 15 months, they immediately returned to America and settled in Montgomery to be close to Zelda's parents, and they swam and played tennis and golf. Scott wrote and Zelda painted. Under the watchful gaze of his parents-in-law, Scott had to moderate his drinking, which made him tetchy, and he was not unhappy when offered a Hollywood scriptwriting job which would keep him away for 2 months. It was a real opportunity, as the film eventually became very successful and made a star out of Jean Harlow. But it did not go well for Fitzgerald, who was fired and the job given to someone who understood the Hollywood formula. When he returned to Montgomery, he was in low spirits, and Zelda was trying to come to terms with the recent death of her father. Hoping for some fresh air and relaxation, they travelled to Florida, but they began to argue when Zelda announced she was planning to write a novel about her experiences in Europe, covering exactly the same ground as Scott's own work in progress. The arguing led to her drinking, which led to her hearing voices and becoming terrified she was being attacked. Dr. Farrell suggested returning to Prongan in Switzerland, but instead she was admitted to the Phipps Psychiatric Clinic at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, under the care of Dr. Adolf Meyer, one of the leading figures of American psychiatry. Meyer was an expert in schizophrenia, but considered Zelda's case unusual, a folie à deux, or joint psychosis. He believed the Fitzgeralds had a complex interaction of denial, cross-identification and escapism into alcohol, and that they were interdependent, enmeshed and entwined. He suggested that Scott would need to accept treatment for his drink problem if Zelda was ever to improve. But Scott refused, convinced that alcohol sharpened his writer's powers of observation. Fortunately, Zelda's mental state improved anyway, and after 2 months she was allowed to accompany Scott for lunch with friend and critic H. L. Mencken, who noted in his diary that she was still plainly off her base and manifested signs of mental distress throughout the luncheon. As part of her rehabilitation, she was encouraged to write for 2 hours a day, and she used her time well, finishing the manuscript of her novel, which she sent off to Scott's editor. After a further 2 months, she was discharged, improved, but still far from well. Mencken described Zelda's mental illness as immediately evident to any onlooker and regretted that Scott was unable to write novels, as he had to churn out magazine stories to pay for her treatment. But he was working on his next novel, Tender is the Night, and as always it draws heavily on his painful life experiences. It's the story of a promising young psychiatrist who marries one of his patients, who slowly exhausts his vitality. Their marriage disintegrates as he descends into irritable alcoholism. Progress was slow, partly because of having to do hack work, but mainly because he was drunk most of the time. This enabled Zelda to get in first with her novel, Save Me the Waltz. Scott wasn't happy at what he regarded as her plagiarism, but realised it was an opportunity to pay off some of their debts. It was long thought that he had made major revisions to make it ready for press, but analysis of the original manuscript and edits showed that the book was all Zelda's own work. It appeared in October 1932 in a short print run on cheap paper. It was poorly reviewed and did not sell well, making Zelda a measly $120. Scott continued working on his own novel, with its destructive Nicole Diver character based on Zelda. He even included some of her letters to him from hospital in the text. A document from this period I obtained from the Princeton archives showed just how close the links are. Headed Parallels between actual case and case in novel, it alludes to the assault Zelda had been subjected to as a teenager, her father complex, and her rivalry complex with him. When Zelda became aware of all this, not surprisingly she was hurt. Her illness relapsed, and in February 1934 she was readmitted to the Phipps Clinic in Baltimore. She did not improve, so the following month she was transferred to the upmarket and very expensive Craig House Clinic 60 miles north of New York. She seemed to enjoy the fine surroundings and encouragement to keep busy, and while at Craig House she had a month-long exhibition of her paintings and drawings at a New York gallery, which she was given leave to attend. Time magazine said, "The show is the work of a brilliant introvert, vividly painted and intensely rhythmic." But one of their close friends from Europe, Gerald Murphy, said, "Everyone who saw the paintings recognised their quality of repellent human life. They were figures out of a nightmare, monstrous and morbid." But she managed to sell most of her pictures, although the asking prices were strangely low, $200 for her watercolours and only $15 to $30 for her drawings. Back at Craig House, she is then said to have become catatonic, a term used to describe people with severe schizophrenia whose speech and movements become so slowed up they can seem more dead than alive. Scott uses the word in a letter to Mencken, but there was no other evidence to suggest that she was this unwell. It seems she was just feeling frustrated at being in a place costing $750 a month when she knew money was tight, and was asking to move somewhere cheaper, not catatonic at all. Not at that point, anyway. Meanwhile, Scott had another brief drunken affair, this time with writer and fellow alcoholic Dorothy Parker. Tender as the Night came out in April 1934, and unlike his earlier work, it received mixed reviews and a decidedly lukewarm response from the buying public. One of the problems is that it harks back to the carefree excess of the Roaring Twenties, an era famously described by Scott as the
most expensive orgy in history.
But all that frothy hedonism had evaporated with the Wall Street crash of 1929, and as the misery of the Great Depression bit ever deeper, no one wanted to be reminded of it. As one critic put it, Americans could no longer afford to drink champagne whenever they pleased or go to Paris on vacation. Fitzgerald, who considered it to be his masterwork, was plunged into depression. With no improvement imminent, Zelda was transferred to the Shepherd Pratt Hospital in Towson on the outskirts of Baltimore. During her 2 years there, Scott rented a large house close by and tried to work, but the years of heavy drinking were beginning to affect his health. His friend H. L. Mencken wrote in his diary that he is boozing in a wild manner and has become a nuisance, and he finally split with him when Fitzgerald dropped his trousers at a dinner party. Alcohol was damaging his mental sharpness and ability to keep the complex structures of a novel in his mind. He was not unaware of this as he signed himself in to Johns Hopkins on 8 separate occasions to dry out in his attempts to beat his addiction. But each time he would fall off the wagon, disappearing on week-long benders and waking up in a different town with no idea how he got there or what he'd been up to. He had multiple run-ins with the law for drunkenness and brawling. He was a mess. There was hope, briefly, when he met wealthy socialite Nora Flynn, who had managed to live a famously bohemian life and be glamorous and vivacious without alcohol. And she did her best to help him dry out, but failed. He based his short story Intimate Strangers on their affair. Another affair with another wealthy socialite followed, this one with Beatrice Dance, which ended with Beatrice having a breakdown and being admitted to a psychiatric hospital as well. But Scott stayed in touch with her and wrote her intimate letters for the rest of his life.
All I know is I'd like to sit for 1,000 years and look at you and hear your voice.
He also had a scare when he developed a rash. He had been seeing a prostitute and was worried it might be syphilis, and he had a nervous wait for the result of a Wassermann test in the next town. But he was genuinely worried about his wife and whether she would ever improve, writing to Harold Ober that Zelda was more pitiful than ever and he could scarcely endure.
The awful, strangling, heart-rending quality of this tragedy that has gone on now more than 6 years with 2 brief intervals of hope.
For most of 1935 she was unable to do anything or take in any news. She barely spoke, and her weight dropped to only 89 pounds or 40 kilograms. She believed she was in direct communication with Christ, Apollo, and William the Conqueror, and was convinced the end of the world was approaching. Fearing she was fading away, Scott had her transferred to Highland Hospital in Asheville, North Carolina, under the care of Dr. Robert Carroll, who wrote several books illustrating his humanistic approach to psychiatry. Scott was massively in debt, upwards of $1 million in today's terms. The previous hospital was suing him for unpaid fees, but falling sales had resulted in a drying up of royalties, just $80 in 1936. Nowhere near enough to fund Zelda's care or pay off the debts run up in their more extravagant days. He had been relying on loans from his agent Harold Ober and publisher, but when they said enough, he just drank. He was living in a faded hotel with 2 simple rooms, one for sleeping and one for writing. In an attempt to wean himself off gin, he tried the beer cure. I'm not sure who came up with the idea of drinking 50 bottles of beer a day as a cure for alcoholism, but surprise, surprise, it didn't work. He was also taking barbiturates and chloral hydrates to help him sleep, which would have had a further dulling effect on his brain. He was at an all-time low. He continued churning out stories for magazines, but few were interested now, and those that weren't paying what they used to. He wrote 3 confessional essays, including The Crack-Up, which were published in Esquire. He regarded them as honest explorations of his spiritual and emotional emptiness. Others viewed them as a degrading exercise in self-pity. And to make matters worse, a journalist tricked him into opening up about his troubles by telling him a made-up sob story, resulting in a nationally syndicated article that revealed more than was wise in an era when alcoholism was still seen largely as a moral weakness, and doing further damage to his reputation and flagging career. He was so distressed and worried that his daughter might see it, he made an attempt on his life. When he woke up from his morphine sleep, he said,
"I'm even a failure at ending it all."
In 1937, he was offered an opportunity to dig himself out of his dire financial straits, with a screenwriter job at MGM. Even though he would have to move to Los Angeles and be away from Zelda, he was in no position to refuse the huge salary. For the next 2 years, he rented cheap rooms around Los Angeles, and in an effort to abstain from alcohol, he drank large amounts of Coca-Cola and ate sweets. Despite earning the most he ever had, it all went on paying off debts, Zelda's medical bills, and their daughter's school fees. Lonely, and with Zelda still in hospital in Asheville, Fitzgerald began a relationship with the English-born former showgirl turned gossip columnist Sheila Graham. But then, completely out of the blue, he received a telegram from his first love, Ginevra King, asking to meet when the recently separated heiress was visiting Hollywood. He didn't know what to do.
She was the first girl I ever loved, and I have faithfully avoided seeing her up to this moment to keep the illusion perfect.
It was like a scene from The Great Gatsby. Should he meet her or not? He even asked his teenage daughter, Scotty, for advice. In the end, they did meet. They had lunch, and he felt Ginevra was as attractive as ever, and they spoke frequently over the next few days. But, unable to cope with all the reawakened yearnings and what-ifs, he started drinking again. And after a barroom brawl, he ended up in hospital, and a disappointed Ginevra returned east to Chicago and married another rich boy. His screenwriting wasn't going well, and in 1939 MGM terminated his contract. He made minor revisions on Madame Curie and a dialogue polishing Gone with the Wind that was never used, but his sole screenplay credit was his work on 3 Comrades. Director Billy Wilder described Fitzgerald's foray into Hollywood as like that of a great sculptor who is hired to do a plumbing job. By this time, though, it's not clear if he would have been able to do either job. Although he managed periods of sobriety, during relapses he would get through 40 beers a day. This could lead to him being abusive and physically aggressive towards Graham, who was incredibly patient and tolerant with him as he went through bouts of depression and made attempts on his life. As Graham had never read any of his books, he attempted to buy her a set of his novels, but after visiting several bookstores, he realised he was no longer on the shelves, a has-been. He did not give up, however. He continued working on his 5th novel, The Last Tycoon, based on his Hollywood experiences and personal knowledge of film executive Irving Thalberg. He saw Zelda for the last time on a trip to Cuba, but his drinking led to him getting beaten up by spectators at a cockfight when he tried to intervene to stop the cruelty. On his return to the US, he had another detox at the doctor's hospital in Manhattan. He managed to maintain sobriety for most of his final year, and Graeme described this period as one of their happiest times together. He was still married to Zelda, of course, and wrote to her frequently and often spoke of his sense of guilt over her mental illness and hospitalisations. But he was ill. Years of drinking had given him cardiomyopathy, damage to the heart muscles. He also had angina from coronary artery disease, fainting spells, and he was short of breath and occasionally coughed up blood. In 1940 he managed to keep writing, working on his novel and a series of gently self-mocking short stories about a hapless Hollywood hack called Pat Hobby. After having a severe angina attack, he was advised by his doctor to avoid strenuous exertion, and as his apartment was up 2 flights of stairs and Sheila Graham lived on the ground floor, he moved in with her. A few days before Christmas, Fitzgerald and Graeme attended a movie premiere at the Pantages Theatre. As they were leaving, a sober Fitzgerald experienced a dizzy spell and had difficulty walking to his car. Watched by onlookers, he remarked in a strained voice to Graeme,
I suppose people will think I'm drunk.
The following day at home, he got up suddenly from his armchair, grabbed the mantelpiece, and collapsed on the floor without uttering a word. He was dead of a heart attack at the age of 44. Only 30 people attended his funeral. His wife was not among them, although she was not in hospital at the time. Zelda outlived him by 7 years, living a quiet life, painting and going to church, between periods in hospital. Tragically, she died in a fire while locked in her room at Highland Hospital in 1948. Now regarded as one of the finest writers in world literature, it's hard to believe that at the time of his death, Fitzgerald was convinced his life was a failure and his work forgotten. But within a year, his friend Edmund Wilson completed his last unfinished novel, drawing on his extensive notes, and this sparked new interest in him and a critical re-evaluation of his work. According to one academic, if you want to know what America's like, you read The Great Gatsby. Fitzgerald is the quintessential American writer. How would F Scott Fitzgerald's life have panned out if he had not drunk himself into an early grave? Well, it would have been longer for a start. But would he have been the writer he was? Would he have been as creative? This is an age-old question. Fitzgerald certainly believed alcohol was essential, that his creative vitality demanded stimulation. He justified his drinking by asking friends to name a single American artist or writer who hadn't died of drink, other than James Whistler and Henry James, as they didn't count as they lived in England. He said,
When I drink it heightens my emotions, and I put in a story, my stories written when sober or stupid, all reasoned out, not felt.
But as he got older, he began to accept that alcohol damaged his powers of concentration. It was okay to dash off a short story when drunk, but keeping all the strands of a novel going in a befuddled state was impossible. So he signed himself into clinics for countless short detoxes, or would set dates when he was going to go on the wagon again. Sadly, however, the only prolonged period of sobriety he achieved was in his final year, but it was too late. The damage was done. Fitzgerald had a fatal addiction to alcohol. He came out with all the justifications and excuses that gave him permission to carry on drinking, and almost every story he wrote had at least one alcoholic character. Would his life have been different if he had not married Zelda? Of course, but whether it would have been better, longer, or as artistically productive is impossible to say. Did she take him away from his writing? Well, yes, definitely at times, but she also gave him most of the material for his novels, and without her early encouragement he may never have finished his first book and ended up a salesman like his father. Some have even suggested that it was Zelda who was the true creative, and Scott simply stole her ideas and squashed her talent with his oppressive and over-controlling manner. In my first video on Fitzgerald, I concluded by saying that they were intertwined emotionally and creatively. Flawed, and infuriating and wasteful of their talents, but indivisible and still in love to the end, and that although Zelda's illness kept them apart and Scott found companionship elsewhere, he never stopped writing to her, he never stopped thinking about her, he never stopped hoping that she might be cured, and he never stopped loving her. This was based on reading their love letters. His first, from August 1918, signed off, "Yours desirously," and the last 2 days before he died. They are beautiful letters, collected in this lovely book, but he was writing similar letters to others, and I have to say I'm less certain of how indivisible they were now. Even before Scott's death, they had lived apart for 3.5 years, and Zelda managed to create a life for herself after he was gone. In some ways, they did better apart than together. Their lives weren't easy, their love wasn't simple, but capturing this in his writing is what gives Fitzgerald his enduring appeal. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this revised and extended biography of one of my favourite writers. And if you haven't seen my video on Zelda, do check that out. It's another long one, but I wanted to do her justice as a creative person in her own right, not just F Scott's wife. And please remember to subscribe and click for notifications, and hopefully I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.